Welcome to our YouTube channel. If you are new to our channel, please hit the subscription button and turn on the bell icon to get our latest updates.
America could be headed for an epic rematch. President Biden is expected to announce his re-election campaign this week, putting to rest questions of whether he will seek a second term as the nation's first octogenarian president. At the same time, polls show former President Donald Trump with a substantial lead in the Republican presidential field, despite facing criminal charges in New York and the potential for more legal problems on the horizon. While the race for the White House remains in an early stage and presidential campaigns can shift quickly, the start of the 2024 cycle shows that a rematch between Messrs. Biden and Trump is a distinct possibility, one that would play out before a divided nation as the two parties uneasily share control of the levers of power in Washington. A second showdown, this time with Mr. Biden in the White House and Mr. Trump as the outsider, could determine how the U.S. proceeds in its support for Ukraine's war against Russia and its work to counter the effects of climate change, as well as how it would balance domestic and military spending and economic policies at a time of high inflation. A 2024 campaign would likely be different from the first encounter, when Mr. Biden limited his in-person campaign events and rallies because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and Mr. Trump used the trappings of the White House in his campaign, often featuring Air Force One in the backdrop of airport rallies. Mr. Biden is expected to open his re-election bid with a video announcement. Advisors are considering a Tuesday launch to coincide with the 4th anniversary of his entry into the Democratic primaries in 2019. Mr. Biden is scheduled to address the North America's building trades unions that day, allowing him to highlight his $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure law before an audience of union members who have backed both Democrats and Republicans in the past. Mr. Trump is planning a response to the announcement, aides said, and he has said the president is vulnerable on a range of issues, from immigration to inflation. Mr. Biden defeated Mr. Trump 3 years ago in an election marked by the COVID-19 pandemic and heated protests over police tactics and racial justice. Since then, the aftermath of the 2020 election has lingered over the nation's politics, with Mr. Trump facing investigations into his attempts to overturn his defeat, the January 6, 2021, riot at the Capitol by his supporters, and the former president's storage of sensitive government documents at his residence and club in Florida. Mr. Biden faces an investigation into his own handling of sensitive documents after his time as vice president, while his son, Hunter Biden, is facing a criminal investigation related to his taxes and whether he made a false statement in connection with a gun purchase. Our politics have only gotten more divided since Election Day 2020, as we saw most graphically on January 6, said Doug Heye, a Republican strategist. Add to that we've never had an indicted nominee, nor potentially a son of the incumbent president indicted, and thoughts of a high-road election on issues are foolish to the extreme. A Wall Street Journal poll released last week found Mr. Biden at 48% and Mr. Trump at 45% in a hypothetical head-to-head matchup, a lead within the poll's margin of error. In testing a potential field of 12 competitors for the Republican presidential nomination, the poll found that Mr. Trump had the support of 48% of GOP primary voters, followed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis at 24%. No other Republican candidate was in double digits. While Mr. Biden faces minor opposition in the Democratic primaries, polls show that the public holds deep reservations about his presidency. In the 6 Wall Street Journal surveys dating to late 2021, an average of 43% of voters have said they approve of Mr. Biden's job performance, while an average of 48% said they approved of how Mr. Trump handled the job when he was president. When a Journal poll asked this month about Mr. Biden's work on 8 issue areas, voters rated him more positively than negatively on only one, his handling of Social Security and Medicare. By 22 points, more people disapproved than approved of his handling of the economy, and the gap was 27 points on dealing with inflation, 26 points on border security, and 21 points on fighting crime. Donna Brazile, a Democratic strategist and a member of the Democratic National Committee, said that Mr. Trump would seek to make a rematch about retribution and revenge over the 2020 election, and that Mr. Biden would be tasked with making the campaign about his agenda and the future. The challenge is for the incumbent president to not allow the former president to make this a grudge match, but instead make it a contest of ideas and a candidate who can solve problems, Ms. Brazile said. Presidential rematches involving the two major parties are rare in the U.S. The last one came in the 1950s, when Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, defeated Adlai Stevenson, a Democrat, in 1952 and 1956. While Mr. Eisenhower won both elections by wide margins, a repeat of the 2020 campaign is expected to be fiercely contested, with a heavy focus on battleground states that decided the last election, including Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, and Georgia, all of which Mr. Biden carried. Both sides see advantages in a second bout. Many Democrats have privately expressed a preference for running against Mr. Trump, pointing to the former president's legal troubles, Mr. Biden's success in 2020 and Mr. Trump's singular role in stoking Democratic turnout and fundraising. Mr. Biden, at age 80, is the nation's oldest president but is only about 3.5 years older than Mr. Trump, meaning voters would choose between two of the oldest presidential candidates to ever seek office. Democrats have suggested that since the two men are close in age, running against Mr. Trump would minimize questions about Mr. Biden's age and abilities. Mr. Trump, meanwhile, has vowed to avenge the 2020 election and has continued to rail against Mr. Biden's record since leaving office, noting the strength of the U.S. economy during much of his presidency and his avoidance of pulling the U.S. into a major military conflict. In recent weeks, Mr. Trump has strengthened his position over Mr. DeSantis, who is expected to announce his candidacy later in the spring but has seen his support slip in the midst of attacks from Mr. Trump. The latest Journal survey, conducted April 11th to 17th, offers caution signs for Messrs. Biden and Trump. Mr. Biden, for example, trailed Mr. Trump by 5 points among Latino voters, 41% to 46%. Mr. Biden carried that group by nearly 30 points in 2020, polling that year found. Mr. Trump is trailing Mr. Biden by 13 points among white suburban women. Mr. Biden leads by a wider margin among what the Journal's pollsters, Democrat John Anzalone and Republican Tony Fabrizio, identified as another important swing group, voters who only somewhat approve or disapprove of either of the two candidates' work in the White House.